Welcome to the Vortex Nation podcast, brought to you by lovers of hunting, shooting, public lands, the Second Amendment, and good food. What's going on, Vortex Nation, and welcome to another Vortex Nation podcast. Now, this time we're coming to you. We're back in the same spot we were with Paul Neese, Ryan Muckenhern, Mark Boardman here to my left, and we're going to talk to you guys about long-range shooting. We're calling this one Long Range 1001 instead of 101. Part of the reason there being, I think people set a benchmark for long-range shooting, oftentimes at 1,000 yards, but for many people, that's a benchmark that seems maybe unattainable. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how to get out there if you're kind of new to the long-range shooting game, maybe some of the equipment you need, some of the things you needed to know, practice, stuff like that. So, guys, thanks for joining us. We'll just dive right in, but long-range shooting, obviously, that's kind of it's a daunting thing to get into. What kind of long-range shooting experience do we have in the room right now?
We've probably all got different takes on it. You know, I come, if everyone remembers, from a Western hunting background. So I've, done a lot of guiding in the mountain country out west, and we do a lot of long-range shooting out there typically, a lot of cross-canyon stuff. So it's something, it's a good skill that everybody should have. We'll get into this probably later in the podcast, but the definitions of long-range shooting and then long-range shooting that's ethical for hunting, there's kind of a whole topic of discussion right in there that we can touch into. But that's sort of where my background primarily came from for doing that sort of thing.
Cool.
Being a hand loader and shooter and enthusiast in general, competitively or recreationally, I've done quite a bit of it. Yeah, and with Paul too, the balance between long range shooting and then long range hunting and shooting is something I do hope we touch on.
Indeed. Well,
definitely.
We should. Ryan, you've shot some pretty interesting things at long ranges. Like you have that pretty trick 22 that you've shot out pretty far, and then there's that high wall that you've shot out pretty far too. Am I right?
Yeah, I haven't brought the high wall out as far as I'd like to yet, but I'm hoping to bring that one out to 500 meters and beyond yet this summer. But the 22 out to 500 meters, that's a good time. Defies a lot of physics. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure.
Need a tremendous amount of adjustment in an optic that's going to be able to pony up that kind of adjustment to get out there. But it's a hoot. It's fun to do.
Well, let's talk about adjustment.
Heck
for
yeah.
Sure. But Marco?
So, yeah, I mean, my long-range shooting experience is probably similar to maybe Paul's and Ryan's. It's kind of born out of not necessity, but having a kind of another tool or in your hunting arsenal, if you will. So, hunt a lot out west, and I'd say even, over the last 10 years or a lot of my time here at Vortex, my definition of long range has changed. My knowledge of long range shooting has changed, and I think that's, for a variety of reasons, including just available equipment, technology, sharing of knowledge. I mean, there's just so much that's going into that now. But yeah, so for me, it's just more hunting oriented, even though I do enjoy shooting recreationally as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've got some good folks then in the room, and I'm just a Wisconsin boy. A lot of you guys have spent time out west where you can see for miles and miles, but 500 yards for a long time was long for me until I went out to the Vortex Extreme out in Utah, and I shot out to 1,200. That was a lot of fun. But,
got out in some big open country.
It's way different out there. But, okay, so we're going to mention a few things here that there's going to be some phrases, words, lingo, things like that. I figured we maybe get out of the way, have like a brief 101 style description for each one of these. These are a few I thought, throw in any as you guys see if I miss any. But I figure obviously we're going to talk about our zero. So, just very basic. Our zero is just wherever we've sighted in our rifle and our rifle scope to. Many people do it at the classic 100 yards. Sometimes there's varying different zeros. Maybe you guys have things to touch on there. But zero is something we'll mention. Our dope. So dope is data on previous engagements. And essentially what we're doing there is that's something when after you've zeroed in your rifle scope, you go to a ballistics calculator, something like that, where you're then plugging in all the information from your rifle scope, your atmospherics, your cartridge that you're shooting, all these things. Hopefully you've got a good muzzle velocity that you've maybe gotten a chronograph out for. And then that's going to give you essentially the ballistics of your bullet all the way out to, any yardage probably that you choose. But that dope then is essentially once you go back out to the range and you confirm it, because you can't always just go off what the computer tells you. Sometimes just Mother Nature or other things come into play and maybe have slight variances. But once you've confirmed it, that's your previous engagement. That's your data on previous engagements. So what you'll get a lot of people do a dope card. We have dope discs that will essentially say at 300 yards, you got to dial in this much, right? and that's something that really is important to have for long-range shooting. I've got MOA and MRAD, obviously two different units of measure. It's essentially like saying inches and centimeters in some ways because there are two different ways of measuring the same types of things, which is drop for our bullets, target sizes, things like that.
Yep, just two different ways of measuring an angle, basically, is what it is.
Exactly. Yep. Ballistics, now that's something we've already said a couple of times. For example, ballistics is just the curvature of your bullet's flight through the air, right? Can anybody think of a better way to explain it?
Yeah, you'll see, maybe you're thinking like the term BC too, Jimmy. That kind of, you'll hear us talk about bullet BC and ballistics, and it's just a measure of how efficiently a bullet is traveling through the atmosphere. It's a way of sort of putting a number on it. So you'll definitely hear more about that as the conversation goes on here.
Yeah, and the BC usually has like a number associated with it. And does it go all the way up to 1? Is that how it works? Or
it goes up higher than that.
It goes higher than that? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a little tricky because there's two ways that the BC is measured, the drag coefficient in G1 and G7, and we'll touch on that very quickly, although we don't have to really get out in the weeds there. But there are two different terms commonly used in BC, so we'll hit that.
All right.
No, I think you nailed it there, Paul. I mean, essentially, it's just how efficiently that bullet
That's
passes
the best way to
through
think
the air,
about it.
you know, and that number via measuring a variety of attributes is assigned to that bullet with, I'd say, generally like a higher BC is going to be a better bullet for long-range shooting, theoretically, because that higher BC bullet is going to
shoot flatter.
Well, like a slug doesn't have a very high BC, but whereas something like a 30 caliber bolt tail bullet would have a much higher BC than a slug.
Exactly.
So it just streams through the air better. So then we got chronograph. Already mentioned that one too as well. Chronograph is essentially a tool that a lot of long-range shooters use to get their proper muzzle velocity. And muzzle velocity is something that you can't always go by the box. I've heard plenty of guys around here say that and have found it to be true myself in practice as well. You know, I think a lot of times people grab the ammo box off the shelf and they look at the muzzle velocity and they just plug that right into the ballistics calculator. That'll probably get you maybe in the neighborhood.
It'll be a ballpark.
But it's not exact. It's not exact. And I know you guys, Ryan and Paul, I'm sure, and Mark, you've used far more of these than I have. But if you speak to just chronographs in general and getting that information.
No, it's a super cool tool. They really haven't changed much since they came out. It's just a device that, except for the new MagnetoSpeed and the new Lab Radar, which are
there's two newer ones that are pretty popular these days.
But effectively, the old version, I shouldn't call it old because it is still current, just uses a brief transmission of light and then interrupting the light with the bullet's path and then a simple calculator to determine like the speed of the bullet between the 2 points that are looking at that light, or these two eyes that see that light turn on and turn back off again, and then it back figures your velocity for you. But new products, MagnetoSpeeds and Lab Radar, which is something you'll hear a lot of guys talk about. The MagnetoSpeed actually measures the bullet by, I guess you could call it the feel of the bullet, if you will, the metallurgy of the projectile itself leaving the barrel. Doesn't use any kind of light source or anything like that, and it actually attaches to your barrel. Very nifty tool. Extremely accurate. I've got one myself. I shoot it often. And the new Lab Radar is that's like out of science fiction, how that thing works. It looks like a tablet. You put it on your desk and you shoot, and it tells you exactly how fast your bullet's going at 100, 200, 300.
No way.
Oh, it's the coolest thing on the planet.
That's awesome. Okay, so why is muzzle velocity important, though? And I guess maybe even velocity at other distances perhaps, too. But why is the muzzle velocity so important?
So if we're looking at ballistics, and if we define ballistics as the study of all things relative to this bullet's flight characteristic and path, the muzzle velocity is literally like the oomph behind the vehicle here, or the horsepower, or the amount of fuel, and anything that would I guess have a number to signify what is going to propel this projectile and how far. You have to plug that number in along with the weight, the atmospheric data, the ballistic coefficient, like we mentioned earlier, as a starting point. It's like the first thing that has to go in there. I'm not going to say it's probably the most critical thing, but it's right up there.
It's one of the top ones. Yeah, you can almost think about it like a baseball pitcher throwing a baseball, and a guy that can throw out the super high speed fastballs compared to a guy that's not as fast. The faster it is, the flatter it's going to go for a longer period of time. It's just I think everybody can visualize that one pretty easily.
Yeah. And I would say that it takes precedence over even BC for a lot of things when you're looking at this, and if we're not getting super technical, but because velocity can overcome BC, it can be a heavier weighted figure. in the ballistics calculation. If you're pushing a bullet fast enough, you can run a bullet of lower BC and actually have a flatter trajectory than a bullet of higher BC at lower velocity. So it's a very important figure.
That's interesting. It goes to show there's so many variables involved, but it also goes to show too, and we'll get into equipment, I'm sure, and everything too, but how important it is to get your muzzle velocity. And so not everybody's going to have a chronograph on it, but I've heard of many ranges where they have a chronograph there that you can rent it or borrow it, or if you got a friend that has one. But it is important if you're thinking about really getting serious.
If you get serious about the long range game, you're really going to have that tool at some point. We used to tell people that if you want to run the velocity numbers that you see printed on ammo boxes, you can sort of limit your effective long-range accuracy somewhere out in maybe the 500 to 600 yard range, and that's really about it. At that point, the variance, if you take that number off the box, it's not absolutely correct, and so you can maintain pretty good accuracy, maybe out to 500 yards or so using that number. But then once you start to get beyond that, you can't trust that number anymore. Yeah. It's gonna start to make too big a difference in that ballistic curve. So it becomes an important tool as you progress out.
It is. I mean, it's a super critical, piece of that puzzle, and definitely for sure like a necessary number to have as accurate as possible to enter into whatever ballistic calculator you're going to use to calculate that ballistics curve. But going off what you said, Paul, I haven't always had access to a chronograph. And we're going to get into a couple things here that we'll probably get in down the road too. But I guess how I've gone through that process is, I use that number off the box as a starting point, generate that ballistics chart, go to the range where I can shoot at a distance where I feel like I can accurately, execute shots with precision, generally about 500-600 yards. I feel like I can get a pretty tight group there. And then essentially, like what you say, validate your data.
That's right. What what you're talking about there, Mark, is validating a trajectory, and I think that would be something else maybe we'll touch on a little bit, because you can sort of end around having a chronograph in a way by using that technique.
Exactly. So I'd get to the range, and maybe my dope chart, or what I would call my initial dope chart, would say, I need to dial X amount of MOA at 500 yards, and then I might find in real life that I'm hitting 2 MOA low, maybe 2 MOA high, and then go back into that calculator. And what I would actually do was tweak my velocity up and down to account for that variance. Yeah. So for me, I don't know actually in the end if that's my actual velocity, but that was the variable that I could tweak to adjust so everything lines up.
These days, most of the ballistic programs will let you do that type of thing, where you can put in actual observed data that might have varied from what initially was predicted by that box velocity. And then you'll see that referred to as validating a trajectory or truing a trajectory. And a lot of the ballistic programs that are out there these days will allow you to do that right in the program. So you can enter in the data you started with, the data you actually observed, and then allow the program to true that up. And the program will true it via tweaking both the velocity and the BC numbers a little bit. But once that's done, then it will, it'll do a future correction for all the other, the future ranges and distances that you put in there. So very handy. Good to know.
That's awesome. And that's actually good, because we're going to get into also, we're mentioning now a ballistics program, for example. Obviously, we talked about chronographs a good bit, but something that's good probably for a lot of people wonder is, what am I going to need to do this too? So just equipment wise, and of course, actually even some non-equipment things, because I do want to make sure you can't just buy to play. You can't, or buy to win, or buy your way to 1,000 yards. You got to actually get some practice in. So the first thing I think is practice. Of course, you got to get to the range and just work on your trigger finger and all these different little sort of skills that you need to shoot long range. But, we're talking about, for example, a ballistics calculator. That's something that you really need for this, because otherwise, how are you going to account for all this bullet drop way out there? I mean, I don't know anybody who can just do all that in their head.
An extremely adept mathematician.
Yeah. Well, when you use the term dope back there, Jim, that the history of that probably predates ballistic calculators, and that's that undoubtedly comes from early snipers that basically accumulated a data book over years and time of shooting, and they simply would record all the the varying distances, the shot, the corrections that they dialed in to get hits at those distances, all the weather conditions, all that sort of thing. So in years past, not everyone had easy access to all these ballistics calculators that are out there today. So in some ways, that there's coming back to that technology thing, it's made a lot of this a lot easier than it used to be. You don't have to have this guarded collection of data that you very carefully recorded over many years in time. You can simply now use the programs to do a lot of that.
Shooting at that rock out there that's at 330-ish, and then that twig out there is a little bit further, and I had to hold over on this hash mark.
Carefully recording the temperature and the pressure and the humidity and all those things.
Yeah. So that's, and that's super important then, and nowadays, like you said, the ballistics calculators make it a lot easier. What are some that you guys use? I know we obviously have one on our website, it's the LRBC, but that's not the only game in town. There's other ones that you can use too. What other ones have you guys seen out there?
Mobile app, I use iSnipe and Ballistics Arc. I've been using iSnipe since I got my first iPhone 4. This was way back when, and I've become very accustomed to it. And I think Ballistic Arc is a little more in depth, but iSnipe
a little different. It's got some other features to it. Yeah, I think everybody, depending on what you've used in the past and history, will have their preferences. I've used Ballistics Arc. I enjoy that one too. And then Shooter is one that I've used for many years. And just like Ryan, I've just become very familiar with the the various screens and how it works. So it's just easy to come back to that one all the time.
Mm-hmm. And those are mobile, right? I know the one thing about the LRBC is it's mostly for desktop.
Right.
Those you're talking about mobile apps.
These are mobile
those are good
apps.
to have at the range.
Yeah.
You can always work on the LRBC on our website right at the top right corner when you're at home on your desktop. Mark, you got any other ones, Dad?
I guess one additional one, I've used Shooter a little bit with like Paul, ours, and then Strelock. I have a little bit of experience with.
That's a popular one, yep.
So, the ballistic calculator, and then, that just goes into so many things. But how about, here's a big one that everybody always talks about, the gun. I don't know how much time we really need to spend on this because you could probably go down a lot of rabbit trails. I don't think you need to go crazy. I mean, heck, Ryan Muckenhern over here sitting across from me is the one who shot 1,000 yards with a Ruger American 6.5 Creedmoor and a Diamondback Tactical on top. So, you can
very
do
reasonable budget. Yeah.
You can do it with a lot of things. There's probably a few out there that would maybe not be the ideal choice. But what's kind of like a good general maybe setup? Doesn't have to be an exact brand and model, but like what's a good general setup?
I'll say this. I was on the range last night. Actually had a customer's rifle up here, and then one of our test rifles. And the customer's rifle was a 338 Lapua that he had bought specifically for shooting long range. And that is not an easy gun to shoot. And I think, and it's a very expensive gun to shoot too. I mean, you're up at that $4 a round.
That certainly comes into play.
Yeah. And so the one thing that I want to tell people is like, if you want to get into long range, you're going to need a rifle, but like step back from the internet real quick and consider something that's affordable to shoot so that you can do it often and frequently and become very proficient with it. And even if that's a 223, you can do some surprising distance work with that cartridge. But like the new 6.5 Creedmoor is obviously very popular. 243, 6 Creedmoor, 308.
Classic.
Yes. And you might be surprised. Dig through your safe with what you already have. There may be a surprising long range gun.
Sure, there are many of them out there. Yeah, from my hunting background, the 7 Remington Magnum is a very popular Western hunting cartridge, but it can also excel at the long range game.
Yes.
And it's been out there for many, many years. It's available in a lot of rifles. So, there's an example of a common one that would certainly work.
Well, and if you do have one that you can shoot more economically, a little bit friendlier to shoot from a recoil perspective, all those skills and experience will translate over in the event you do need to use a heavier cartridge.
Yep. And to credit that 6.5 Creedmoor, not to say that that's the best long-range cartridge, I think that's why that thing has gotten so popular, is because it's very affordable to shoot. It's very low impact on the shooter. And most of the guns you can get it in are quite accurate, actually. And if you go out to the range as a regular Joe, if you will, or a regular Jane, and spend $100 on ammo, you can shoot it all up and not feel fatigued. You don't have a flinch. You're not bruised. Your eyes aren't trying to roll out of their head, afterwards. And I think like that is the most valuable thing. Find a shootable cartridge.
Yeah. And, hand in hand, and I completely agree with Ryan on the 6.5 Creedmoor. It's a great choice. The other thing there that particularly makes that one attractive is there is some very, very good factory loaded ammunition available for that. Mm-hmm. Very consistent, very accurate. So you don't necessarily have to be a hand loader to get into that. You can buy that ammo off the shelf and it performs at the level of hand loaded ammunition. So that takes another sort of hurdle out of this for the someone new into the game. You don't have to be you don't have to be an expert on hand loading.
Right. Am I mistaken? And actually, most people who shoot the 6.5 Creedmoor, there are hand loaders, but don't most just go with the factory loads?
Yeah, it's the factory Hornady ammunition is very, very good for that cartridge. Yeah.
Sweet. But then, okay, we talked a little bit about the rifle, obviously, and I think the important thing to take away there is just, I'm probably just repeating what we've already said, but just you don't need to go crazy. You don't need to go to some super custom kind of Gucci rifle builder. Not that they make a bad product. They make fine products, I'm sure, maybe once you get more serious into it. But this is a 1001 course, right?
So, yeah, a lot of nice off-the-shelf stuff.
Yeah.
You do want something that shoots fairly consistently, though. I'll throw that out there. You can find that out at 100 yards range. You don't necessarily have to go out and immediately try shooting at long range, but you need something that groups fairly well at 100 yards. There's not much point trying to shoot accurately out at 800, 900, 1,000 yards if you haven't got a rifle that can shoot very nice tight groups at 100 yards. So that's a pretty good indicator.
Exactly. I think that's what I was going to touch on. No matter what the rifle is, it needs to be an accurate rifle, and something that we talked about, guys will say, at least I guess if you think in MOAs, like a sub-MOA rifle, which I'll get in. I know we're trying to keep things basic, but I think a common misconception is that an MOA is 1 inch, right? And I think roughly it is, right?
At 100 yards.
100 yards.
That's people forget
at 100
that
yards.
Too.
But it's actually 1.047 inches at 100 yards, even though in terms of long-range shooting, I think we would all suggest that a person essentially quit thinking in inches and think in MOAs or mils, depending on their respective setup. But, and getting back to what Paul was talking about, if a gun doesn't shoot good at 100 yards, it's just extrapolate that as you go out, because like we're talking about it, MOA or mils is an angle. So that bullet is essentially on an angle. So if you picture a piece of pie and how, I guess, either line on the angle of that pie extends from the center.
Yeah, that same inch at 100 yards. Let's say you can shoot groups and you could keep all your shots at 100 yards within a 1 inch circle. Well, that's really a little borderline for long range shooting, because what you think about is that same angle. Now, if we take that out to the 1,000 yards, now you're shooting in a 10-inch circle, and so it's opened up considerably out there. So if you can remember that, it'll tell you. So even that rifle, you may think you're doing pretty well to shoot the 1 inch groups at 100, but that opens up pretty big when you get out to longer distances.
That's true. It does. We talked. Okay, I got to bring up one more thing about the rifle, actually, that just popped in my head, too. But one thing to consider, one of many, but barrel twist. Here's one thing. And I kind of bring this up as a little bit of a random thing to bring up, but the other day I was at the range, and we were shooting a 243 out of a rifle that had, I believe, a 1 in 12 twist. And I accidentally grabbed some heavier ammunition.
And it didn't like it.
And no, it did not like that. And I was all over the map. And I remember thinking to myself, what is going on? And I had to look up, and finally I looked on the website and found that I was shooting a 1 in 12 twist with this, fairly heavy bullet. And there was my answer. But I guess that goes into just, that's another thing to look at, to consider what kind of ammunition you're going to want to be shooting, because you want to make sure that that's actually going to be able to pass through there accurately.
That's a good point. That is important. And typically what happens in the long range stuff is usually the slightly heavier for caliber bullets tend to perform better. They'll have higher BC numbers, so they fly more efficiently through the air. But then correspondingly, those bullets usually need to have a bit faster twist to them to stabilize properly.
Yeah, you don't want to shoot them like a knuckleball.
Yeah,
essentially.
Exactly. It's interesting though. But if we think back about cartridges that are like on the scene now as premier long range cartridges, like time machine back to 1997, guy named Jim Carmichael in Remington came out with a cartridge called the 260 Remington, which is like super popular now. However, it failed miserably initially on a commercial release because they twisted the guns wrong. So all the guns that you were getting were 1 in 9, 1 in 10 twists, and they couldn't stabilize anything over 120 grains, and it fell on its face. Well, the guys who built guns and who knew what this cartridge was capable of started twisting them faster, 1 in 8, 1 in 7.5, 1 in 7. And I would say arguably this cartridge spawned the 6.5 Creedmoor, but the twist rate was wrong from the factory guns in the first place. So nowadays, this is getting kind of corrected, and we're seeing a lot more 6.5s come onto the American scene and 6s come onto the American scene, and the factories are doing the guns right.
Twisting them a little faster.
Yeah, correct. or more appropriately for those
Right.
heavyweight bullets that
Right.
you talked about.
This is why we bring Ryan on, because he always has interesting history.
That's a great
things
story,
to bring
yeah,
up.
yeah.
Thank you for that, Ryan.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's get into, and we kind of saved this one a little bit, but it's probably obvious on the Vortex Nation podcast. Let's get into the scope a little bit. And I think, again, we'll mention that you don't need to go crazy. I think it's easy. Anybody can watch that video we have on YouTube where there's a Diamondback Tactical, which costs like $300.
Mhm.
Actually, the 3 to 9 costs even less than
$279.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And,
yeah.
and we made it out to 1,000 yards. So it is doable with many different things. So, but what are some of the things you guys look for in an optic? And it can vary too, maybe depending on the rifle or the application. But for long range shooting, what are some important things? I can think of turrets being one, but go.
Yep. Turrets, decent glass. The turrets probably are one of the key things that long range shooters look at right off the bat. You want a turret that generally an external type turret where you're not having to pull a cap off it every time. You want it to be one that dials very repeatably up and down, so you are going to be using that turret to make those corrections for distance. So it should have nice, you prefer nice, solid, good feeling clicks when you turn it. You want it to be very repeatable, so when you turn it up and you come back down to that 0 that you mentioned earlier, Jimmy, that hits that perfectly on the same time, every point coming back. Good glass is, certainly important on the scopes. You want the ability to see the target well, but there are many other things too.
And good glass you bring up too. Now, let's talk about that for a bit, because one thing that people look at all the time when they look at long range rifle scopes, or they think about shooting long range, is they think, man, I got to get the most magnification I can get. But I've heard Ryan say it before. I've probably everybody actually in this room say it before. A really excellently crafted optical system with a lower magnification trumps that of a lesser optical system in terms of clarity and all those other things, but with higher magnification. So essentially, quality over quantity when it comes to your magnification. Would you guys
100%.
agree?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would rather have a scope half the power of a big magnification scope if it was 25% better optically.
Right. And what you find too is when you shoot with lower magnification, the scopes are just easier to get behind. They're friendlier. You'll find your head placement just easier. You'll be able to pick the target up quicker. So there are a lot of advantages there. Yeah, you don't automatically have to have just the highest magnification possible out there. If there are some venues of shooting where if you're trying to shoot very, very small targets, perhaps some extra magnification helps. But it's a balancing act. You have to remember in these scopes as you progress from low to mid to high magnification ranges, the resolution of the scope is going to go down. It's going to get worse and worse the higher the magnification you go.
Right.
So
No matter what
there's
scope you've got,
no matter what scope, whether it's a low end, mid range, high end scope, they're all going to get worse as you go up to higher magnifications. So there's a sweet spot somewhere in the middle in there that works very, very well.
For sure. And I think, when you think long range, a lot of times the competitive scene for that type of shooting long range is often you've got PRS. That's kind of a big one that I've seen. There's also F classes and things like that, but kind of for this sake of this argument, we'll think of the PRS guys. And a lot of guys out there, for example, running Razor Gen 2 4.5 to 27s. Now, 27 is obviously a high magnification. You think that'd be the one that they prefer for their longer range shots, but I hear of a lot of guys actually mostly running somewhere around like 18. So
I'm sure
you
that's
mentioned
absolutely
that sweet
right.
spot.
Yeah.
And I guess that I remember that always interested me at first when I was kind of getting into long range. But yeah, sometimes even the biggest magnification is actually not always the best one to use.
Right.
It has its places, but
Yeah, and in any sort of dynamic shooting, whether it's hunting or PRS or a sniper out in the field or anything like that, the ability to find the targets is key. And so you're running lower magnifications, you will have a wider field of view. So it's faster and easier to locate targets that way too. So that's something to always remember on that.
Yeah. And you may locate that target on a lower mag and then zoom in if you
Right.
like as well,
Yep.
which is kind of nice to have, that upper end after you've acquired that
Right.
target.
Right.
I'd throw out there, a lot of these long range scopes have, more complex reticles, either a mill or MOA based, hash mark based reticle, oftentimes with a windage tree in the lower hemisphere of the scope.
did you say windage tree just because? No, I know you're not trying to X Christmas out of there.
No.
That's not your style. That's not your style. We'll leave that for the public
Jim, I
schools.
could barely say windage tree. But
It can be called the Christmas tree. We like the Christmas trees.
I guess it does have all the dots that would maybe represent ornaments.
There you go.
Oh,
Carry on. Oh, I interrupted.
But anyway,
That's Now he's lost his line.
I know. I lost my
apologize,
train of
Mark.
thought.
We were talking about
Technical
reticles.
reticles.
Technical reticles.
Now I hate Christmas.
And, no. No, we were talking about reticles. Technical
but so
yeah.
So oftentimes these scopes have more technical reticles. Essentially more information in the reticle for the shooter to use, and I'd say as by and large with our scopes, you want to have those things match. So if you have MOA turrets, you want to have an MOA based reticle.
Very important there. Very important.
It's just so much easier.
And because we are talking about dialing, predominantly the elevation component. I don't know if you guys could hear that, but I think we just got hit by lightning.
First thunderstorm of the year. I'm so excited.
A zero stop or a locking turret can be a really handy feature just because you are taking that turret up and down. And it's nice to be able to, if you lose track of turns or heck, maybe you go to the range and you're dialing up and down and you forget to return it to zero. That's just a really easy, convenient way to come back home and know that you're back on zero.
Great part of the scope, yeah.
Yeah, not a need to have, but a really nice to have. Even if it's a rotational stop, like in the HST or HSLR or something like that, or the Gen 1 PST, just as long as, because after you're dialing all day, you just bring it back down, and it at least stops you from going a full revolution beyond. So when you pull it out, that's timeout. You're not wondering where the heck you're shooting.
Like you said, that zero stop feature or locking turret's not necessarily a need to have, a very nice to have, and probably two features that you're going to find on kind of those upper tier, upper echelon scopes.
For sure. And then I'll bring up one last thing that's just equipment wise when it relates to kind of the optic too. And then I'd like to get into the dialing part as well, but is the rings, because I think that all too often someone will get a really nice rifle. And then they'll say, oh, man, I got this really nice rifle. I got to put a really nice scope on top. And then they go out and get a really nice scope. And they're like, dang, I'm out of money. I'll take those rings. And they just get the cheapest rings. And they didn't realize that what they did was they took two precision instruments that need to perform together in harmony. And they connected them with, like, something not precise.
Right.
And it's just... That's like the most important part.
It's very important. It is very important. Yeah, unfortunately, we do see that quite a bit. It's a big mistake. It's not the place to try to save a few pennies.
No.
When you're looking at the overall package of the rifle and the scope, buying a good quality set of rings is really not going to cost you all that much more. And the problem with the inexpensive rings is the machining tolerances generally are not all that great. And so what happens to the scope is put in a set of rings that don't quite perfectly line up with each other. And then that very subtly bends the scope a little bit, and all of a sudden the scope doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't adjust well, it doesn't track well, doesn't come back to zero. So that's a great point, Jim. Don't cut corners on your rings.
Right, or even potentially it slips slightly in the rings, or just things like that happen. And we see scopes come back that have been in a really poor quality set of rings oftentimes, and the person's having a tough time getting it to group well or to dial well, and we see ring marks all over the scope too, because those rings have just been digging in because they're not very well machined, they're not very concentric, and that's just what happens. So don't skimp on your rings.
Don't save the pennies there.
No. But anyway, like I said, I wanted to touch on that one, but we've been talking about dialing a lot here. And I think that's an important thing. And now that we've gotten everybody set up, right, we know the terminology we're using here. We know kind of what you'll need. I think it's really easy a lot of times for people to get behind a rifle and a scope that's already set up to shoot 1,000 yards. A lot of times I've gone to the range and somebody goes, hey, like, check this out. This is my new PRS rifle. Check it out. Shoot it at 1,000. You just step up and all of a sudden, put the crosshairs on and ping. And it's awesome. You're like, hey, man, I'm a good long-range shooter. But you don't realize everything that went into actually getting it out there. And a lot of that is dialing. We've mentioned getting your muzzle velocity. We've mentioned, kind of figuring out a lot of just the physical assets that you need to get out there. But just when it comes to the actual kind of calculation portion, I'll have you guys talk about it. When you've zeroed, what's the process of then just getting out there? And maybe a little bit before if you got to get into that. But
it's like baking a cake, I guess. And the dialing is like the final spin on the blender. Like that's the thing needed to mix it all together and produce that product, that long range impact.
So maybe we do have to talk about the zero in too. I probably should have. Yeah, I shouldn't have nixed that out.
Let's touch it. That would be kind of the baseline part, is to to get the scope installed, use good parts, buy a decent scope, have a decent rifle. And then you're going to take it and you're going to do a 100-yard zero, just like you might any other hunting rifle that guys are using.
Hey, Paul, real quick there. Explain why you would recommend a 100-yard zero versus maybe a 200-yard zero.
A couple of reasons. It's very doable for most everyone to find a place to shoot at 100 yards, so there are no issues there. The other thing is that as we get into this, you'll find you have to start to pay attention to atmospherics out there. So when you're in different temperature ranges, different altitudes, all those atmospherics will affect that ballistic curve we talked about. And 100-yard zero works well because it's a short enough distance that varying atmospherics, temperature ranges, most of the normal elevation changes that guys would take, they have very little effect at 100 yards. So that 100-yard zero is going to work in many different places. So it is good. Yeah, the 100-yard zero is probably the best place to do it. A lot of the Western hunting guys sometimes will zero out at 200 yards, but they're trying to maximize what they call a point blank zero. We won't get into that. That's kind of a hunting thing. It's not really tied into this long range shooting. So yeah, 100-yard zero is a great place to start. But that's like the building block for all of this is get a very solid 100-yard zero. You'll find out if your rifle shoots tight groups. You can work through all those initial problems right off the bat. But when you get it down and you've got the ability now to show exactly where you're going to hit at 100 yards, keep those bullets in a nice tight little group, hopefully maybe a half inch or so, you're off to a great start there. And then we'll go back to Ryan and he can sort of touch the next stage that a guy would use after that.
Yeah. So assuming you've gotten all these components together and you've got your map or your ballistic data out, the process of dialing is just that. We reach up, we grab the turret, and we input that information into the rifle scope. And whether it's MOA or MRAD, that adjustment is making your rifle scope move internally, effectively changing your zero to whatever the distance your target is.
Can I ask a question real fast? When you talk about you've gotten all the information from a ballistic calculator, for the most part, most of these ballistic calculators sort of prompt you for the information. You don't have to sort of like make it up or figure out what they want. They usually give you, hey,
fields.
I need the muzzle velocity. I need the, okay.
Correct.
Anyway, carry on.
So yeah, I mean, the dialing, the rotation of that turret, and I'm referencing the elevation turret specifically here, is just changing your zero effectively from your 100 to whatever the distance of your target is based on those calculations and the figures that calculator spits out. And like we talked about earlier with validation, though, you may find that it's not exactly that. You may find that it has to change. If we recall that video in which we were shooting that Diamondback Tactical out to 1,000, my calculator told me it was supposed to be like 28.2 something MOA of adjustment for an impact at 1,000 yards from our 100-yard zero. But in validating on that range, we actually found out it was like 31.5. So there was a considerable discrepancy there. And
walk through the listeners what you did there, Ryan. So you dialed that. The program told you to dial in 28 MOA, and you dialed it and then shot and then observed that the bullets were striking low.
I fired and I saw that low impact, and the shot was good. And this is through an experience thing where I think a lot of folks might go out to the range, and I implore them to kind of be patient with themselves and their weapon system when they are shooting it. But, through experience, you pull a trigger, you'll know when you broke a good shot. It's like shooting a bow, too. You know when it was good or you know when you pulled. And at that shot, that first shot on steel at 1,000, like it broke well and it impacted far lower than I had anticipated it to. Like I could see myself missing about the size of the plate,
Mind you, spotting through a 9-power Diamondback Tactical. Anyway.
Pretty darn good little optic, by the way, if you guys are looking for something. But
which, again, highlights some of the advantages of shooting some of these, gentler cartridges.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
True.
So I saw that impact low, and using the reticle, in that optic, it's a VMR1 MOA reticle, I was able to reference where my hold was relative to where my impact was and dial that correction back into the scope. So I added that additional almost 4 MOA into that, fired again, second round impact on steel, and then we were off to the races. We were hammering away on that thing. So that is a kind of an interesting touch on range validation. Just happened to be at the target I was shooting at,
And we're bringing up, too, some correction things as well, which, you might have had more, but Mark also brought up earlier the whole MOA and inches things. And so you were just talking about dialing an MOA, which is important to consider, especially at long range. Had you have tried dialing in inches, you would have been a lost mess.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a very good point.
The turrets don't say inches on
no,
right?
No, they say MOA or MRAD.
If you ask me how many inches an MOA was at 100 yards, I could tell you it's 1.047. If you ask me what it was at 117 yards, I will blink and stare at you because I have no idea. But speak the language that your rifle scope is built in. And it's like reading a tape measure. One of the guys downstairs says that too. If you're a carpenter, and your architect gave you a blueprint for a home built in inches and a tape measure in inches, you could build the house. The same could be said with centimeters and a tape measure in centimeters. You could build that house to that print. There's no inches in your scope. Speak the language of the scope. You'll find it infinitely easier.
Mm-hmm. It's what the reticle is in. Like
Yep.
you use the reticle,
Yep.
for example, and you're on 9 power, and there's a first, second focal plane, whole podcast out there. You should probably listen to it if you're thinking about this. But you're on 9 power, so
Yep.
your reticle is calibrated essentially to the proportion of the target.
Mm-hmm.
And so you were able to just use what we already know on the reticle, which are those hash marks, like a ruler or like a tape measure in a way, and then make your dials. Because holding over and dialing is essentially two different ways. A lot of times you're doing the same
Yep.
thing. You're
Yep.
moving where your barrel is.
Yeah,
pointed.
look at the reticle as like the I don't know if we'd call it the manual version of doing it, and then the turret is I guess it would be manual too, but like an overlay versus a correction. Yeah, it was really quite cool, and we had a lot of impacts on that thing by the end.
Oh
of
yeah,
the day.
couple, yeah. And okay, the other thing too, when you dialed and you were low to get higher, what direction did you dial?
Follow your turret. Your turret will never lie to you.
You dialed up, right?
Correct.
Because that's where you wanted your bullet to go.
Correct.
Up.
Looking through the scope,
Right.
though, it moves your reticle down, and this can be very confusing because it's opposite. But if we think of
But
how
that does
to
get people. Yeah.
how to force your muzzle, if we need to move our bullet's impact up, the scope has no bearing on the projectile itself. It's simply forcing you, the shooter, to reorient the gun. So if we move our reticle down, we have to force our muzzle up. It's going to allow us to change the angle and the arc that we're going to use to get down range. So
Right. Yeah. If you think what happens if you're looking at a target and you dial up and then you're watching and you see the reticle travel down in the field of view as you make that up adjustment, but then think what happens next to hit that target. Now you have to lift the whole thing up a little bit to put the crosshairs back on your target. And then what you've done is you've elevated the muzzle of the rifle.
exactly.
So, yeah.
I can think of two analogies that might even provide, some clarity. One thing I think is like if a person's throwing a football, right? What do you have to do if you want to throw to a receiver that's further away? You need to throw it higher and give it
That higher arc.
that
yeah.
higher arc,
Yep.
that higher trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
Or we talk about the turrets on a rifle scope, and you think of a gun turret on a Navy vessel,
sure. Yep. Yep.
which possibly I don't know if that's where these get their names or not. But
I would
mean
assume.
that's what's happening. Essentially, the barrel, if you will, on that gunboat is
Pointing further up.
pointing further up if the target is further away. And when you're adjusting the turret on your rifle scope, you are in essence moving that internal erector tube
Mm-hmm.
where the reticle is located up or down.
Mhm. Right.
If we're talking about just the elevation turret here.
Right.
So you're moving that up
Yep.
to engage that target that's
Yep.
further away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
trust
Yep.
your turrets. And,
Yep.
and a lot of different rifle scope manufacturers I've run into over the years will have different ways of doing it. But I've never seen a rifle scope that has ever been machined backwards. So it's a common call we get.
Mm-hmm.
So it hasn't happened yet, folks.
Man, I tell you, somebody would have
How
to go
often
in
do you get that call, right?
It's
That comes
because
in here pretty regular.
time one or two a day probably during peak shooting season.
completely shut down the whole factory, redo the whole machine, do one turret, quick shut it down again, redo it all over again, and then make all the rest of them the right way.
Yeah.
That would be a nightmare.
So trust your turrets.
Yeah.
They will point you in the right direction. No pun intended.
Totally.
Another thing I'll circle back here really quickly. Ryan had talked about using your reticle to measure those when you're seeing distance and you're watching those bullet strikes, and then using that reticle to measure those gaps and then correcting on the turret. Circling back to Mark mentioned the Christmas tree reticle earlier. Well, that's where those kind of fancy reticles that have lots of reference points, both for drop and also the windage, the left and right, they allow you the ability with that sort of grid pattern that you look at to see where those bullet strikes on the target, and then you get a visual correction for both the drop and the wind. And so now you can correct on that follow-up shot. And that's where the big benefit of the Christmas tree style reticle comes in.
Right.
Well, I'd say it can also be very beneficial for if you're shooting with somebody.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh.
If they have a similar setup or identical setup, they can really assist in calling your shots.
Yes,
So if
exactly.
they're, by measuring off their reticle, if they
Right,
see your
right.
bullet splash, whether it's, on the target or in the dirt, they can give you a correction to say, hey, you need to come left or right or up or down just by measuring off off of
Right.
their reticle that's in their rifle scope.
And we see that every year with the team shooting events that we do out at the Vortex Extreme, where two shooters, you can definitely help the other guy out by watching those shots. Yeah.
Definitely.
It's like playing Battleship with a friend.
It is.
Yes.
But
Who doesn't like that?
No.
well, hey, what else you got? Because I think we might actually have to do a long range shooting 1002 at some point. But I see some other good stuff. Maybe as we start to round out, because Ryan and Paul did an excellent example of, just speaking you essentially out to 1,000. There's a few other things I see on your paper that are important too, but maybe we can further elaborate on some other stuff too at another point. But
So, and this is something I've heard Paul mention in the past, and it really was almost like a revelation in my mind. And we're talking a lot about distances, and we're talking about known distances, right? So really, none of these things happen without knowing the distance. And like this just really struck me when you said it one time, Paul, is that the rangefinder was really the catalyst for a lot of these things coming about.
Oh, it was an absolute game changer. Absolute game changer.
And you kind of look at the foundation, like none of these things happen without having a known distance, or at least not very well.
No,
Right.
trial and error.
Yeah.
So, that's another thing a person is going to need if they're not at a range with maybe, previously marked yardages.
Yeah, you
distances.
can't do the long range game without a rangefinder.
Right.
Right.
it looks like about 7.
Right. So, that's I guess, we're talking about tools earlier. That's definitely a tool that you're going to
Yeah.
use.
Oh, it's
That
huge.
is
When I spent many years in the past as a professional guide, there were years that I guided before the advent of laser rangefinders, and part of what you made a living at as a guide was your ability to accurately estimate ranges. And it was pretty interesting. I lived through the time when laser rangefinders first hit the markets, and so I had the interesting experience of hunting in a variety of terrains, steep slopes, cross canyons, all that sort of thing. And I hunted the same country every year, so I sort of knew in my head what I thought these ranges were from previous years of of guiding hunters and working in these areas. And to go back once rangefinders became common, and it was almost an overnight thing. It happened really in 1 year. And to go back and now have the ability to instantly and very accurately tell the distance that I was going was just eye-opening. There were some I was actually pretty close at, but there was a whole lot of others where I was not anywhere near. And so, no surprise when you got those long shots and that stuff, you couldn't make accurate hits without that. So rangefinders are they're a key part of this puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess a lot of this was assuming you're at a range with all the targets already pretty much laid out for you, but if they're not, or if you got to figure it out, whew.
Yeah, if you were to be out in the field and you were looking at long range shooting and you had unknown targets and you lost your rangefinder, that game's pretty much over.
Yep.
You could start sort of lobbing things out and taking guesses, but that's a slow and
Set your rifle down and pace it out.
We always figured that's how you did it. You found the sheep, you walked out to it, came back, told your clients about 302 paces.
ran out there quickly, crawled up to him and ran back.
Judging by how tired I am, I'd say I just ran about 1,000 yards. So
I suppose if you lost your rangefinder, that'd be a good reason to have a lot of data in your reticle to see where that first round hit.
Yeah,
Yes,
that would be your only option really. And in that instance, if it comes to live game, you better not be shooting at game trying to estimate that sort of thing. You might shoot off to the side
I'd
someplace
say
at a rock.
A rock on
Yeah.
the same hillside.
yeah.
That's,
Did we just borderline graze the what's too far to shoot game at? I don't want to get into that too much because otherwise we might take forever. But don't shoot a game unless you know you can hit it.
Yeah,
Right?
we'll maybe just hit that quickly. It's a very contentious topic. It's certainly changed a lot in the last few years, and I think there are a lot of ethical concerns in there. And obviously, none of us want to shoot at game and wound it. That's it's something you really should strive not to do. What the definition of long range hunting today is versus what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, though, it's changed a lot. What's happened is the rise in technologies has really, it's made the ability to shoot accurately at long ranges keep progressing out there. And where that cutoff is it's still a touchy subject. It's dependent very much on, many things, the rifle, the equipment being used, the
Shooter
talent
skill.
of the shooter, the weather conditions, wind is, we haven't touched on wind yet, but wind is a huge part of this long range game. It is the most difficult part of the game. So everyone has to kind of make that call for themselves. But as you said, Jimmy, the goal is if you're shooting at game is you want to make a lethal hit. So you have to have that ability to keep your shots within, say, maybe an 8-10 inch circle and no more than that. And as soon as wind, for example, comes into play, then all of a sudden that range has to come in a lot closer. Your ability to keep shots in a tight circle with a crosswind blowing, the further out you get, the worse and worse it gets. So everyone kind of has to make that call for themselves. We won't get in it too deep to just picking a number and throwing it out there. But
I like the way our man Steve Ranella on Meat Eater says it. If you pull the trigger and you thought, oh, I wonder if I hit it, that's
not a good thing.
It's different for some people.
Yeah.
Me, I'm not going to, personally probably engage it as far as Paul might, just because Paul probably would be able to shoot a little bit further out than me and know that he hit it. But
and of course, we're talking about hunting here. When it comes to shooting steel and targets, now that ethical picture is gone out of there. So now, someone we would highly encourage them to go out and shoot in crosswinds and high winds and learn that sort of thing. That's the way to begin to develop a feel for how to shoot under those conditions. You know.
Yeah, it's a very different conversation when somebody says, "What is long range for a shooter?" And are we talking steel? Are we talking critters?
Exactly.
For me, long range steel is, well, golly, I pick the horizon, I guess. When it's hunting, anything
the further the better. Yeah, the further the funner.
If it's hunting, it's like 300 yards. I consider long range, and then anything over that is you're seriously taking a minute to figure out
everybody
what's
has
going
to kind of draw their own line there. Where you feel under the prevailing conditions that you can keep that shot in a lethal kill zone. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Paul, you nailed a couple things there, but I mean, I think one of the biggest ones, it's based on the individual. It's based on their experience, their capabilities. My maximum effective range might be vastly different than yours, and so it's difficult to say what that is. Bullet performance.
That's a huge one.
I mean, so that's definitely going to come into play. Like, we're advocating shooting some of these, milder cartridges, right? Which is awesome for steel, but those things aren't going to have the same downrange performance at extended ranges that maybe a heavier caliber might have.
Right. Yeah. When we're talking about hunting and killing game, then you get into that topic of the bullet performance when it strikes and how does that bullet expand and become lethal. And that is a big part of that too.
But I mean, and even to relate it to archery, I know guys that 40 yards might as well be 1,000 yards, and then I know some guys that can very effectively and routinely and consistently hit targets and game at 100 yards, and sometimes
amazing
beyond,
talent.
right?
Yeah.
And these are exceptions, right? And this comes with extreme practice, extreme ability. They obviously have a knack for it. So I mean, all these things just, I guess, like I said, it comes down to the individual. But
you just have to be careful. I think everyone should recognize, though, that for good or evil, better or worse, the technology has improved leaps and bounds over what it was, say, 6-7 years ago. The equipment, the bullets, the scopes, the rangefinders, everything, all these different parts of this puzzle have gotten much better. So you have to be careful. If you have a personal setting that you feel is an ethical limit for long-range hunting, be careful about throwing that number on someone else, though, because everyone has to do that call themselves.
Agreed. That was a good end right there. But on that note, how about we do a quick last call on long-range shooting? Everything we talked about here, long-range shooting 1001. What do you got, Mark? We'll start with you.
My last call is probably the thing that we didn't talk about that you could talk about a lot, and the different ways of compensating for it is the wind. And Paul touched on it briefly, but the wind is a ever-changing fluid component that at least you can accommodate for it. I guess, mathematically to some degree with a wind meter, like a Kestrel or something like that. But also the wind at your position, it may not be the same as the wind between you and your target and at your target. So even then, even with this technology, you are guessing a little bit.
Yeah, when you boil this down and you start to learn the basics of this, what you fairly quickly come to is you begin to have to learn to deal with wind, and wind is the trickiest part of this whole game. The ballistic the calculators and programs that we talked about earlier, they allow you to plug in a certain, you might guess a wind speed at 10 or 15 miles an hour, and you can plug that into that calculator, and it'll tell you how much left or right of your target to hold to compensate for that wind. But the whole trick is coming up with what is that accurate number? Is it 10? Is it 12? Is it 13? Yeah. And like Mark said, then you have to deal with the fact is, it's blowing near me. What about mid-range? What about downwind all the way at the target? So all those kind of come into play. So it's a real puzzle. That's what really separates the masters at long-range shooting is the guys that are really good at guessing what that wind speed is.
So, yeah, that's what I got.
Good last call.
That's huge.
Paul, was that your last call?
The thing I would throw in there is to let everybody know that this is a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Whether or not you hunt or not doesn't really matter. Shooting steel at long range is an absolute blast. It's an incredibly satisfying thing to do, to learn a little bit about this, learn how to use a program. Like you said earlier, Jim, you don't have to spend a fortune on a rifle and a scope and all this. You can do it with some very mid-priced stuff. But the satisfaction of figuring this stuff out yourself, going out to a range, and then being able to hit a small target, a small piece of steel out there at 1,000 yards or beyond, it is, we all know it. We've all done it here. It's just a whole lot of fun. There's a huge level of satisfaction to it. So I think anyone can go out and do that and just really enjoy it.
That is a really good last call.
That is a good point.
Yeah, good.
Is it even worth me trying to?
I don't know.
I don't know either. The biggest thing for me, my last call is we get this question a lot. If you decide that long range shooting, target shooting is something you want to get into, the immediate tendency that we see is folks go out and they overcaliber themselves, they overscope themselves, and they probably over rifle themselves. And it can be very discouraging when you've got a system that doesn't work or is not very forgiving anyways. It's like getting into a very high horsepower car. I wouldn't want you to take your driver's test in an F1 car because it's going to be pretty squirrely. And the same can be said with rifles. And we talked earlier about shooting rimfire at long range. And I'm not telling you to go out and spend a bunch of money on a 22 necessarily. It's not probably the best route to become a proficient long range shooter. But what it has done for me is I've been able to shoot, and I shoot quite a bit, probably 1,000 to 1 with my rimfire. I mean, I shoot it every time I go to the range. And instead of having, 1,000 yards between me and my target, maybe I have 300. But the form, the execution, the techniques, using the optics, wind calls, holdovers, corrections.
All those skills. Yeah.
It's all interpreted the same. And I go buy a box of inexpensive ammunition, and I go out and shoot it. And I can learn the optic that I'm using. I can learn trigger control. I can learn all the fundamentals that really make up probably the bulk of this recipe for success, and then execute it at 3 cents a shot instead of $1.33 a shot, and that's a big thing. So,
yeah, and you can do all those same things at a much compressed distance.
Oh, yes.
You don't need that actual 1,000.
Yeah.
What you're doing at 300 yards or 400 is equivalent to a centerfire rifle shooting out beyond 1,000 yards. So it is a great way.
Even shooting 100 or in at very small targets with a rimfire can be hugely beneficial. I was shooting last night at 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch diameter targets at 50 yards. And having to use my reticle for hold off at that distance and having to dial and play with it there, it can teach you a tremendous amount. So get a rifle that you can shoot a lot, that won't break your bank, won't sink your wallet or your ship or whatever, and something that you're comfortable with and you can become very proficient at just pulling the trigger a lot.
That's great advice. Great advice.
You guys had so many good last calls that mine is just going to be thanks for listening. And if you have any other questions about long-range shooting, definitely hit us up on any one of our social media platforms with hashtag Vortex Nation Podcast. Other potentials for topics, obviously Mark brought up wind, and there's many other things that we could talk about with long-range shooting, but of course we tried to make this kind of a 1001. But that said, if you find yourself out on the range and you're following a little bit of what we talked about here, but you just kind of reach a point where you wonder, you're not quite sure where to go on, 800-426-0048, extension 5. You'll get one of the dudes downstairs. All these guys here on the phones are very experienced long-range shooters. Any one of them can talk you right through it, literally while you're on the range, and just help you get out to 1,000. Like Paul said, it's a heck of a fun time. Brian once put it in perspective for me. You're shooting essentially a little rock 1,000 yards away at a piece of steel. It doesn't get any more caveman than that.
It really
in a
is.
modern way.
Yep.
So that's a good time. But anyway,
Our spears have improved.
Our spears have improved, yes. So anyway, again, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time. All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks everybody for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. Leave us a review or comment down below. We want to hear what you have to say about the show, maybe what you like, maybe what you didn't like, so that way we can make these podcasts as good as they can be. Hey, if you were interested in some of the information you heard here too, but you don't want to go all the way back and listen to the whole thing again just to get out one little nugget of information, check out the link in the description because we'll have this in PDF form with pretty much everything that we've talked about. You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'll be posting about each episode released, so that way you can go back, find these things, maybe grab a little nugget of information that you could take with you to the range, out in the field, or maybe to the kitchen if we're talking about some good food. So, again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.